in what we take for granted.
Thank you. And thank you for that last discussion, which was really interesting. What I'm going to do is not introduce the whole roundtable. I'm going to introduce Linda Mcmullen, and she's going to have some introductory remarks. Then we're going to turn it over to all the panelists to make very short remarks. And then we're hoping to hear from those of you in the audience about situations that afflict you as qualitative researchers. Linda.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the roundtable discussion titled Afflicting the Comfortable, Questioning What We Take for Granted. My name is Linda Mcmullen, and I'll start this session. Our goal today is, as Jeannie mentioned, is to make ourselves uncomfortable. Specifically, we want to question some of what we take for granted in qualitative inquiry and psychology in the service of improving the quality of such inquiry as a field. Joining us today are four experienced qualitative researchers: Neil Korobov, professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia in the US, who studies social interactions as sites for identity development; Jeannie Marecek, a US cultural psychologist and critical feminist scholar whose interests concern gendered aspects of psychological suffering; Frederick Wirtz, professor emeritus, Department of Psychology, Fordham University in the US, whose interests include research methodology, philosophical foundations of psychology, and phenomenological psychology; and myself. I'm Professor Emerita, Department of Psychology at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and my interests are in critical health research. To start the conversation, each of us have agreed to provide a brief statement concerning a feature or set of practices that have shaped qualitative inquiry in our discipline, which perhaps should be rethought or jettisoned. Jeannie, do you have the slide to put up, the PowerPoint slide? If not, I can do it, I think. Okay. So these are just brief statements that kind of orient you to the four issues that the four of us are going to bring up. So during these presentations, please feel free to add your comments and ideas to the chat function. And after the presentations, we hope all of us can engage in a conversation that casts a critical gaze on what we do and perhaps suggest ways that we could proceed differently. I'll start off the discussion, then Neil, Jeannie, and Fred will follow in that order. I'll just give a bit of history and context to what it is that I want to say. My interest in qualitative inquiry grew out of necessity. While engaging in my first area of research, the use of metaphor in psychotherapy, I realized that the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask about this topic were not answerable through statistical methods. I discovered that other approaches to research and data analysis, qualitative methodologies and methods, existed, and I began what has become a career-long process of learning about these methodologies and methods. This process was aided by my developing and teaching courses in qualitative inquiry at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. As my research interests shifted to the study of depression and the use of antidepressants, I became absorbed by the potential of discourse analysis for in-depth focus on how people talk about what depression is and is not, and about the controversies over the use of antidepressants. I see this confluence of interest in metaphor, teaching of qualitative inquiry, and my gravitating to discourse analysis as a preferred methodology as leading me to what I want to highlight today, and that's the metaphor of the methodological toolbox. At first glance, this metaphor seems apt and useful. It draws attention to an expanding collection of research strategies and practices in our discipline, specifically to the addition of a variety of qualitative methodologies and methods to the expansive collection of experimental and quasi-experimental approaches and quantitative statistical methods that have been available for decades. It also importantly underscores the notion that the research question should drive our choice of methodology rather than the converse. That is, it upends the criticism that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In other words, it highlights that a researcher in our discipline can now choose from a number of methodologies and methods and can match the choice of a particular option or tool to a particular purpose. However, it was during my teaching of qualitative inquiry that I gradually became uncomfortable with this metaphor. Because the students in my classes typically had no prior exposure to qualitative inquiry, I structured my courses as broad surveys of a variety of epistemologies, methodologies, and methods, and underscored the importance of the research question driving one's choice. But I also came to feel that while it was important for students to have a sense of the scope of qualitative inquiry, I was being disingenuous in not challenging the toolbox metaphor. Specifically, that the metaphor ignores or does not foreground what the researcher, the so-called user of the tool, brings to the research endeavor. For example, one's ontological and epistemological commitments, values, analytic skills, and propensities. That is, the metaphor does not acknowledge that with experience, many, perhaps most researchers begin to see the research endeavor within a particular set of commitments, and in fact, begin to shape research questions according to their familiarity with and kinship to a particular methodology. In my own case, I now find it difficult to think of topics for research and research questions in other than discursive terms. While I'm knowledgeable about how various methodologies are suited to particular forms of research questions, I no longer believe that many qualitative researchers are likely to be equally facile in using a number of methodologies or methods, the tools, that are matched to corresponding research questions. Rather, I see the research endeavor as a dynamic and intimate interplay between a researcher's knowledge of and experience with a methodology and the formulation of research questions. So I propose what might seem as counter to accepted teachings, specifically that oftentimes our research questions are, in fact, driven by a favored methodology, and that many of us are not easily inclined or able to use a range of methodologies. While the metaphor of the methodological toolbox might have something to offer at a disciplinary level, it can fail at the level of the individual researcher. I'll pass it on to Neil.
Thank you. My interest is in qualitative analysis, good analytic practices. Analysis being the key word here. Not theory or meta theory, though I'm interested in that, but analysis. What we do with the data, how well we analyze it, the craft skill. I'm not convinced that simply doing something non-quantitative with our data is necessarily richer or deeper or more humane. I sometimes feel that the analytic goals of systematicity, rigor, and working closely with what our participants are actually doing are simply slogans in qualitative analysis that have more bark than bite. In short, I worry about superficial analysis. I worry that the claims that we make about our data often do not bind to the data in what researchers might call analytically tractable or demonstratable ways. I worry that too often our colloquial prose summaries and that type of summary that we offer, in doing so, we rush too quickly to establish higher order thematic codings. And when we do that, we wash out nuance, particularity, and some of the messy and most interesting contradictoriness about what it means to be human. My contribution to this roundtable is to highlight what I feel are some good analytic recommendations that I think avoid these issues and concerns. They are recommendations that I believe hold true for whatever qualitative analysis or perspective that one adopts, which is a big statement. So I'm going to name 4 here really quickly, and then I can open up and unpack them more in the roundtable if there's interest and time. The first recommendation is to work decidedly on analyzing action rather than moving too quickly to parade excerpts from our data that simply bolt on to themes. This means analyzing language as action. When you analyze language as action, you highlight what the language is doing, what our participants are doing when they talk. That is, how their talk is consequential for the people that use it, how it is taken up, how it is attended to, how it is made relevant in the context in which it occurs, which needs to be shown explicitly in our analysis. That's the first recommendation. Second recommendation is to avoid as much as possible when we summarize our data in our analysis, to avoid these sort of broad, overly colloquially sounding prose summaries, which I read a lot. Qualitative researchers have to do something with the data, and not just anything counts. One thing I see too often is this kind of colloquial prose summarizing of data. Summarizing themes of what participants say typically does not involve any analysis of the language that they are using, at least not in any sophisticated way. A summary is likely to lose the detail and discursive subtlety of the original. The summary will necessarily be shorter and tidier. It will be phrased in the analyst's words and often less so in the speaker's words. It will lose information as such and add very little. Third is the recommendation to identify patterns and sequences in talk, rather than just engaging in what I'm going to call feature spotting of analytic features or theoretical constructs. The two are different. Qualitative researchers are quite adept at both labeling a wide variety of conversational and rhetorical procedures, as well as finding their pet theoretical constructs at play in their data. However, simply pointing out such analytic or theoretical features does not constitute sound analysis. Good analysis should not consist principally of feature spotting, either at the level of rhetorical procedure or at the level of theoretical construct. It's got to do more. Finally, the recommendation to use performative language rather than psychologizing or psychological language. And this one may be the most insidious and the one I see the most. I often notice that qualitative researchers slip back, maybe inadvertently, into a kind of traditional psychological understanding of the relationship between language and cognition, where language is often seen or treated, at least, as a kind of reflection of the mental or the cognitive world, or as a referential medium by which we can study mental entities like beliefs, attitudes, emotions, and so on. Part of the turn to language that has defined qualitative work over the last 4+ decades involves resisting this move. So in this respect, healthy qualitative analysis should resist positing mental entities in their analysis and should instead concentrate upon examining the performative use of psychological language in the various forms of data one is working with. For example, when a participant talks about what they believe or their beliefs, we ought to analyze talk about beliefs as a kind of interactional and rhetorical performance that is doing something, accomplishing something in the moment, something social, something historical, something cultural, rather than analyzing talk about beliefs as a reflection or route to what's happening in the mind. Now, it's not that the latter is unimportant, it's that it ought not be the first move. There's a massive difference between the two, and a lot of qualitative analysis misses that difference. So those are just 4 of my analytic convictions that I hope to stir the pot with, and I'm happy to put those out there and talk more about them in the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. That's a lot to think about. I want to turn the discussion in a somewhat different direction. As I thought about what I might say today, I reflected on many, many years, almost 20 years of working as an editor of Feminism and Psychology, an international journal that almost exclusively publishes critical qualitative inquiry, as well as several years of reviewing manuscripts for other journals and serving as a reader for theses and dissertations by psychology students and some of the time for anthropology students as well. Many of the manuscripts I read were fine pieces of qualitative research, but I came to see certain stumbling blocks that occurred over and over and over, and I'm choosing to use my time to point to 2 of them that I see. First, most manuscripts give very detailed descriptions of their data analysis procedures, and these seem to get more and more elaborate, as time passes, and the scope of qualitative inquiry and the scope of conversation about it increases. We have descriptions of multi-stage coding techniques, sometimes with flowcharts attached to them. We have assessments of inter-rater reliability, coding of inter-rater reliable procedures, and so on. We have now required statements about researchers' reflexivity and positionality, sometimes just standing out there, not in the service of anything, detectable. But the descriptions of data gathering as opposed to data analysis, the descriptions of data gathering, by contrast, are often quite perfunctory. In some cases, there's no mention of the data gathering procedures at all. And this lack of attention, I think, mirrors the scarcity of methodological discussions in psychology of data gathering procedures in the emerging psychological literature. Two aspects of data gathering that I want to talk about that I think warrant much more discussion and reflection. One is about how, one is about who. I think there's others as well. The first one, how do we scaffold interview participants to provide, I'll say, thick talk, using thick in the Gertzian sense, thick talk about themselves and their experiences? How does a researcher move from his or her knowledge interests to deciding on the best means of gathering data that will address those interests? Too often, novice researchers, and sometimes not so novice ones, ask their participants to answer the research question, rather than that the research question is for the researcher to answer, and the researcher's job is to think of how to gather data that will provide some insight into those questions. Consider one researcher, a dissertation student, who asked 10-year-old girls, please tell me about your body image. I think that's a bad question. It might be a great research question. It's not a good interview question. In other instances, interview questions just seem to leave an interviewee kind of floundering. For example, one investigation of heterosexual couples about how they do couple posed this question to, and this was the only interview question in the study. Please tell me about all the experiences you made as a couple. There are also issues of when and how, and I think sometimes if, to ask sensitive questions. For example, a dissertation student whose thesis I read studied adolescent girls who were hospitalized for an episode of suicidal behavior. The very first question in the interview encounter was, do you abuse dangerous drugs? Hardly a question that is inviting, and actually had nothing to do with the project. I had no idea where that question came from, but I certainly knew it was not a good question to lead off an interview of a young girl. Ironically, when I think back on what I think I know about gathering data, I learned far more about gathering data, psychological data, from sociologists, Bob Weiss, Emerson, Fretz and Shaw, Howie Becker, and anthropologists than I did from psychologists. So that's one point. My second point is, what considerations should guide researchers in choosing the set of research participants that can best address their research interests? Too often, it seems like sheer expedience is the only consideration. There's no sign of a deliberate engagement with the question of what collection of people, and I mean collection taken collectively, what collection of people is best suited to answer the research question? And I note that often in my own projects and many others that I know, as a qualitative research project unfolds, researchers change their ideas, usually expand their ideas about the collection of individuals from whom important data needs to be obtained. So you may start out thinking, I want this kind of person, and they think, well, now that I see what's going on here, I think I need also to talk to some other kinds of people. So in some of my own work in Sri Lanka, which focused on adolescent girls in hospital, I then wanted to talk to the doctors who took care of them. And then I wanted to talk to the mothers who really took care of them, who provided so much of the caretaking in the hospital, to understand the constellation of ideas and interactions and social pressures that were governing their what had led them into the hospital, how it was understood, what would happen when they left, and so on. In the US, of course, conventional researchers, and maybe elsewhere, have come to draw on random allotments of anonymous people whose participation is purchased from online survey firms like Mechanical Turk, Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, and so on. Both the platforms and the people refer to themselves as workers. For these workers, producing data is a job. It's an easy way to earn money, and some of them spend several hours a day doing it. That's not my idea of a high quality research participant. I think that this, and I am beginning to see qualitative researchers who turn to Qualtrics or whatever to grab up some congeries of individuals who they then study, without much attention to who they are or what their social location is, and so on. I think this practice reflects several unspoken ontological and epistemological assumptions, ones that are common to natural science psychology. For example, that human beings are interchangeable units. There's something generic about them, that their thoughts and behaviors are the results of properties inside their heads, and that their situatedness in culture and society can be disregarded when the question is to get them to do work to produce our data. Of course, many, maybe even most, qualitative researchers espouse quite a different image of the person, but I worry that our sort of automatic fallback methodological choices may not be consistent with that image of the person. At least in the US, formal training in psychology seldom brings forward explicit discussions of the ontologies and epistemologies of what is called the scientific method, as if that's one thing. And without such discussions, we run the risk of swimming in an ocean of natural science epistemology without knowing we're wet. And then if we don't bring issues forward, like issues having to do with data gathering and so on, we fall back on what we've always done because it's the natural thing to do. So the question I want us to ask in the discussion is, how can we bring to awareness the divergent ontologies and epistemologies of both quantitative and qualitative psychologies, and the ways that they shape research practices in the discipline? Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Fred Wirtz.
Thank you, Jean. And if I might take a minute or a second to reflect a little bit on the previous presentations, I think they all have to do with scientific norms, normative considerations, meaning what should we do? Not do we do, what should we do? And I think all of the three previous speakers have talked about the norms of our discipline, and I will too in my own way. I guess the topic that I would like to focus on, that I think has already been implicit, at least, if not explicit, in some of the other speakers' issues, concerns the complexity of psychology, its heterogeneity, its unity, and that means its topics, its methods, its theories, and also its philosophical foundations. And I guess my leading question is whether there is a possibility of unity in psychology, and whether we as qualitative researchers should be contributing to the field of psychology as a whole, rather than isolated silos of methods. Linda made reference to the problem of psychology having one preferred norm methodologically, and then making it into an idol, the sort of idolatry of method, which ignored the very questions and goals that psychologists have. And that has historically been such a problem. But we have gone beyond that, and psychology, especially think now of the qualitative and the quantitative psychologies, has become very heterogeneous. So we don't have that problem of homogeneous methodology anymore, but we do have a problem of fragmentation, siloization, and all of that. So I guess my question is, do we want to let 1,000 flowers bloom in different gardens? Or is psychology in some sense a unified discipline that can have and should have methodological norms? And I'm suspecting that all of you are claiming there should be norms. And yet, on the other hand, I suspect that many of you are inclined toward differences that don't necessarily communicate with each other or critique each other or develop with reference to the discipline as a whole. So let me then just go back and take a little more time to talk about my own personal and career trajectory. Back in the 1970s, early 70s, when I started studying psychology, I was appalled by the discipline's homogeneity. I was appalled by the discipline as a whole. And as I critically analyzed it, I thought the problem really is its method, and particularly its philosophical foundations. And that had to do with the homogeneity that I referred to, the methodology and all of that. And so I've really spent the last 50 years trying to help the discipline. So the context of my work is really, it's on psychology, trying to make psychology a better science. And I think that really means introducing norms that were much broader than the ones that I confronted when I first started studying the discipline. So I found phenomenology. I thought phenomenology was needed in psychology, and in several ways. Like one would be as a providing philosophical foundations for the discipline. Now, note when I say that now, I can't help but think, oh, there's a lot of critique of foundations. Some, and especially some qualitative researchers say, that idea of foundations is bad. So what about that? I think I still believe that psychology needs philosophical foundations. And I'm not sure that it should have like 6 different alternatives that basically just oppose each other and have no normative unity among them. And that critique among them is absurd. Because like as Ulrich Neisser told me when I criticized his approach in an APA symposium, he said, you and I are just doing completely different things. We have nothing to say to each other. And I disagreed. I thought my critiques applied to his work because I was really talking about cognition and perception and what it is and how it should be known. And I was arguing against him, but he refused to engage with me. Now, I think, so I've gone on and what does phenomenology have to offer? Also methods, core methods that, would these methods be necessary for the discipline as a whole? I'm thinking about, for instance, the phenomenological reduction. We can go into that if you need to or want to, but but the attitude of focusing in on specifically psychological phenomena, as opposed to a reductive attitude that would look at the physical world or the world independent of experience, or independent of the psychological phenomena. I want to include language for Neil especially, and Linda. So methods. Then also phenomenology contributes insights into the nature of mental life, but you could read a lot about that. But to me, more important is the methods and the philosophical foundation. So as I've gone on to study this, I've found a tremendous amount of unity in the analytic methods. I've looked at the analytic methods, and I found so much that's in common among phenomenologists, existentialists, humanistic psychologists, psychoanalysts, cognitive psychologists, William James, Freud, even Darwin when he does psychology, and Kohlberg, and across the board. Whenever I dig into what psychological analyses involved, I find what I think are pretty close to the same thing. So, but wait a minute, that's, now our qualitative research methods is stretched out all over. It's like, are you doing narrative methods? There are 5 different books on phenomenological methods, and they argue with each other. To me, that's bad. We're just proliferating method. In fact, anybody who has a new procedure calls it a method, and then it's their method. And I think this is part of the problem of why descriptions of method have to be so elaborate, because they're all over the place, and you have to say what you've done because the norms can't be taken for granted. I'm thinking that, I'm coming back to the idea that we do need unified norms, and that all of us should be contributing to psychology, not just our own little silo of qualitative methods. I think we ought to start looking at a lot of what we do as procedures. They're procedures. And I'd go back to what Linda seemed to want to jettison, the idea that procedures can be appropriate and adopted according to the questions and the goals that we have, and that they, I don't like the tool metaphor necessarily, but that should be done, because, and it's like, what are psychological problems? We need to confront that normatively. I think Neil was talking about that. Is psychological life a performative life? What is it? That's an ontological question. And I think we can debate those things rather than just saying, oh, well, discourse analysts believe this, phenomenologists believe this, you do your thing, we'll do our thing, and we all just come apart at the seams. I don't think that's good for psychology. I don't think that's good for us. I don't think we engage with each other critically and enough with the integrity of psychology as a unified discipline in view. And so I'll end with that and say that I think, unity is really important. And I think we're coming apart at the seams. And I think, unfortunately, we're losing our normative kind of perspective in the discipline. And I think that looks very bad to quantitative psychologists whose norms are all too rigid, And so I think we ought to be addressing also the norms of psychology in a broad way, including quantitative psychology, so that our philosophical foundations would be sufficiently sophisticated to include quantitative, all methods and all procedures, in a way that we would understand what those methods do and what the procedures are appropriate for in terms of questions. And if we could then lay all that out and begin to work on that kind of a foundation, we wouldn't have to account for everything we do in every research report. And we also wouldn't be going in, a couple of dozen different directions with no communication among us. Thanks.
The end.
The end. Fred, you left us speechless.
And the beginning.
I see in the chat a question from Annie Baxi, which might start us off. Annie, do you want to speak your question?
Yeah, it was, hi everyone. It was not really a question, but I was so much in agreement with what Frederick was saying, because I'm in India and we teach undergrad students qualitative, and every year we have so many dissertations that we are going through, and the same, so even loosely speaking, IPA, when I'm going as supervisor, I have to read so much because of one approach, because the IPA that I was trained in and the IPA that I followed also has so many fragments of it and often contradicting each other. So you don't know what you're really evaluating. And then, how do you evaluate? I mean, in the university system, we are evaluating, right? And what becomes our criteria to evaluate? Because there's so many methods. And that is where, yes, typical quantitative researchers become easy to figure out that what the research is trying to say and what it is not trying to say. So what is included in a method, what is not included in a method becomes fuzzy at times. So I resonate with what you say. Thank you.
I see a comment from, I'm going to say your name wrong, Ovidiu Gavrilovici. I'm afraid I said his name so wrong, he doesn't recognize it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank I was just saying that it was wonderful listening all these argumentation and the diversity of views and the call for unity around at least the discipline or the science of psychology, and also the responsibility which is incumbent of. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Fred, I'm a aficionado, sort of Ludwig Fleck. And, you know, Fleck's idea of thought styles and thought styles that are kind of like pre-reflective understandings, and that are held in place by thought collectives, which really police people from thinking in other ways and engaging in certain kinds of critique. And so how do you distinguish unifying psychology from imposing a kind of rigid thought style on them?
Well, to me, science and psychology as a science is absolutely in need of criticism, self-criticism. Science is not something that has methods that are set in stone, that are the same over time, nor are the findings. And so that the critical dimension of psychology is really so important. And I think that all work should be criticized. All work is corrigible. All work is taking place at a certain point in time. It's limited, it's inadequate. Our knowledge does not live up to the phenomenon and the questions and even the goals that we have. It's always open to critique, and progress in the discipline is really essential to what science is. So I would say that criticism of everything, the philosophical foundations, the methodology, the methods, the findings, you talk about participants, data collection, all of those things are open to critique. And I think critique is really healthy. And I think that, that the norms of the discipline should include and require critique at every turn. So I believe that that unity does not mean heterogeneity, and it certainly doesn't mean the adaptation of a lockstep approach by everyone in the discipline. So does that answer it?
Say more about what unity.
I'll come back to you.
Fred, can you say more about what unity would mean if it's
What
not
is unity?
Yeah, well, I think a few things. First, I think if nothing else, it means debate on issues that we hold dear in common. And, also, I think it means understanding each other. I think it means position taking. I think it means that we all should have an education where we learn enough about philosophy not to have to follow what any particular approach would dictate without critical reflection and some knowledge of it. That's tough, but that's an aspiration. That's normative. Same thing with methods. I find that, people argue over phenomenology, but they don't know what it is. Like the other participant in the conference was saying, IPA. Now we have different versions of IPA. The phenomenologists argue with each other. But I mean, it's really, it's horrible. We need to be able to understand each other, and we need to have a common knowledge of our discipline and our methods and what's fundamental and what's not. I'd love to have a conversation with you and Linda about, for instance, like you made an assertion that psychological life is fundamentally performative. You seem to put an emphasis on language, and that, in fact, you even asserted, if I got it right, that language would have to be analyzed before experience. Now, to me, I would contest that. I have no problem with focusing on language or experience, but I don't know that I would assume that that language has to be analyzed prior to anything else, or that it's privileged to analyze language as opposed to anything else, because I would say there's pre-linguistic experience. Now, I know discourse analysis is different from phenomenology, and I love the difference, but I think we ought to talk about that. And I think we ought to resolve those things through dialogue, through critical dialogue, but most of all, dialogue that has real mutual understanding.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There are a couple of people who have their hands up, Heidi Levitt and Christopher Liskey. So Heidi will go first and then Christopher.
Hi, I'm just so happy to see all of you. And I miss a lot of the folks on the panel, and I haven't had the pleasure to meet Neil, but really enjoyed the presentation. And so I want to send hugs out, but then I'm just thinking about your comments, right? And the things that you've shared, and just have a few reactions that I'll try to make quick. So I liked what you were saying, Linda, about like the whole toolbox idea. And I guess I haven't thought of it as like the idea. I haven't thought of it as that people should be using a whole bunch of different things in the toolbox, but more that people should have different methods. I do think that it's good to have methods that fit the questions you have. And I think that researchers often have a set of questions that are their motive, especially if they're researchers who are focusing in an in-depth way in some area. And so it seems natural to me that then they would be using the same tools, right? It seems to be like, to me, that seems to meld kind of what Fred was saying and what Linda was saying a little bit together. It makes sense of it for me. And then from Neil's presentation, I love the idea of, I think that there's this whole movement towards more critical, more functional, more discursive kinds of analyses, which is super exciting. And also, like, we're drowning in the superficial stuff. and so thinking about, how do we engage in really deliberate practices in our analysis and data collection, as Jean was saying, seems to be so incredibly valuable. I think something that I always get upset about is, like, I know that we talked in our standards about like that it can be helpful for people to have reflexive, to reflect upon or to describe how they managed their use of reflexivity and but to talk about the use of reflexivity and the management of reflexivity as it illuminates the study. So not just 2 sentences about like saying my gender, my race, my professional affiliation, and then I move on, which is totally useless, right? And then Fred, like I kept thinking about our work on methodological integrity when you were talking about unity, because Fred and I and a SQIP task force worked together on creating these standards or these guidelines or recommendations for how to evaluate qualitative research, and thinking about those as something that could be a beginning maybe of a common kind of language for qualitative research. And I like the idea of having unified norms, and so I get excited about hearing you talk about that. But also, I'm also holding like that people have different goals, and so even if we have norms, somehow we have to be able to move between having unified norms to having different methods that fit goals that are different depending on people's research projects. So for me, that would be like that's something that I was thinking about. So those are my thoughts, but I also just wanted to give hugs. So thanks.
Thank you. Christopher,
Thanks,
do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. So I had another question for Dr. Frederick Wirtz, actually, and it concerns one of the virtual salons that SQIP had recently. It was just earlier this year, I believe. Let me see if I can pull up the name. One of the speakers at this virtual salon was Joshua Clegg. It was at the Curriculum at the Crossroads salon, and he was talking about an idea he came up with, sort of like a metaphor, but I don't think he himself would have posed it necessarily as a metaphor. I think he saw it as, in many ways, being very literally this way. He saw each of the different traditions of doing qualitative research as epistemic cultures. So they're not just theoretical ideas, or not just these constructed thoughts about what to do with our research studies. They are actually social systems with their own norms and values in place that kind of cultivate a certain mindset and attitude towards doing qualitative research. And he proposed that the best way to kind of bridge the gap between all of these epistemic cultures was to cultivate a kind of the word he used was something along the lines of cultural, I forget the precise term he used, but essentially he was trying to propose that we try and cultivate this attitude of being able to speak the language of multiple different epistemic cultures rather than just one, and try and become a little bit more well-versed in how many different people from many different essentially social systems of doing qualitative research and be able to use that to create a little bit more unity within qualitative psychology. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and see what your thoughts were on that kind of presentation. I believe you were there as well and saw that same presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I think what you're saying from what Josh Clegg, and you're resonating with what Josh was saying, makes a lot of sense to me. And I think in many ways, it's exactly the same thing that I'm saying. There was also a great comment in the chat from Jenny Pack, who asked about other cultures' ways of knowing. And I've been working also on indigenous psychologies and their methods and their critique of Western science. And that they show often spiritual methods that entail spiritual practices that involve the culture very much. So I think this whole idea of psychological science and psychological research in its cultural embeddedness, not only its scientific culture within small communities like discourse analysts, phenomenologists, experimental psychologists, but more broadly, cultures of different societies, different groups, different ethnicities, different larger cultures. And I think that science can be unified and can have a unitary norms that are global and that are cross-cultural. And I think it absolutely requires understanding, challenging ourselves, letting others who have radically different views question and challenge us, and understanding the ground and validity of their challenge. And this is difficult work, but it really does require position taking and self-transcendence and dialogue and critique going both ways. And I don't think these things are settled once and for all, but I think this should be normative within our discipline so that it's continually moving forward in a sort of a dialectical way with these kinds of very tough dialogues that require transcending our own groups, our own cultures.
Thank you very much. It sounds kind of like one of the big points you want to highlight here is there can be different kind of cultural values, both in terms of epistemic cultures, as Joshua Clegg was talking about, and actual different cultures, like different geographical backgrounds and different social backgrounds. Those can be there, and that is okay to have. And matter of fact, it can be beneficial to have those, but there should be essentially this overarching value of, if nothing else, at the very least, having cross-cultural dialogue there.
Oh, absolutely. That's so important. And, it's really the problem of relativism. And I know there are those in psychology who actually advocate and champion relativism. I don't, I think unity is important. I think there should be a ground for dialogue, and, absolute relativism doesn't allow any critique. It creates people who can be opposed without any ground or means of relating to each other. And so I think it's really important not to mistake unity for homogeneity or tensions and differences. I think that it needs to be included and welcomed in the unity, and needs itself to be a normative principle within the science for dialogue and critique and mutual understanding. even if there's with difference. Yeah.
Neil, you were going to say something?
I just want to say I want to be careful not to demonize relativism. I mean, the sort of draconian absolute form that you mentioned is dangerous, but there is also just a sort of obvious form of relativism that appreciates the fact that everything sort of makes sense from particular perspectives and not others. I see that as a kind of benign relativism that is so obvious that we ought not.
That sounds like an absolute statement. Neil, that sounds like an absolute statement itself.
Well,
You just made an absolute statement.
I maybe that's a benign form of absolutism, and for me, it's almost just obvious rather than. I guess the challenge would be to find an example where that wouldn't be true to me, because it seems so on the face obvious, rather than me trying to impose that as a kind of absolute dictum by which to then to manage all of our epistemological commitments accordingly. Like I wouldn't want to do that, to say that, you know, we must always appreciate the inherent difference and operate accordingly, and if we don't, we're bad. Like that wouldn't be where I'd want to go, but I would just open with the observation that sort of the relativistic differences between approaches make sense because, and they're important because they are all coming out of a particular contextual position, a micro contextual positions, and interrogating the differences between those positions, I think could be valuable and could be very interesting. So at that level, I see that as a kind of soft relativism. Then there's the hard, heavy, what you said, the way you then characterize it as an unbounded, or the word you use. But those are the forms I do get worried about because they're very draconian.
And Fred, you would leave space for, and others, you would leave space for people to have particular, to be drawn to particular approaches, to feel that their analytic heart rests somewhere, while also being aware and being knowledgeable about others. Is that sufficient?
I think so. I think so. But I also, yeah, I mean, I think that's inevitable. And I think it's already happening, and it's always been that way. And I think that probably would be part of a solid normative sort of system for our discipline, that people cannot be omniscient. They cannot take every perspective. They live in communities. They specialize in certain things. As you said, even the questions they ask may already imply a method that they're expert in and that they're good at and they know how to use, and they know how to spot problems for which that method is key. And so none of that is bad or a problem. And I also agree with what you say about, but they should also be aware of other approaches and have them in their education, because I think it's so important for people to gravitate toward those approaches that genuinely fit with their temperament, their sensibilities, their talents, their skills, you know, and as we were saying before with Christopher's comment, their culture. You know, we don't want to exclude Native Americans or Filipinos or Chinese or Indians just because they can't resonate with you know, our particular methods. So, you know, I think we must accept different cultures, different styles among researchers. And I think if that becomes part of our understanding of our scientific norms, we actually have a richer and more realistic and less relativistic understanding of our science. So, you know, I would say, you know, the whole antinomy of, you know, the absolute relativism is absurd, you know, extreme relativism is absurd. You know, like on the other hand, a sort of a homogenistic imperialism is absurd. But it's not that we need a combination of the two either. We need norms that really describe what our discipline should be. And I think we can debate about them too. But I think we need to understand each other and debate about it in a way that, you know, is moving us together in some sense and not further apart.
So
I know
Fred,
those of us who have been on the curriculum committee of SQIP for a number of years, some of us have fantasized what, if you were going to use a textbook to teach undergraduate students about research, what would that textbook actually look like? And how, you know, if you had a really integrated textbook that actually taught important concepts of research from various positions. I mean, that would be really great.
Yeah,
Not
that
so
would
much
be
the
so great.
technique, but yeah, important ideas that are part of all of our research, but that have very different configurations depending on where you're at. And showing the students those contrasts, where they actually mesh, where they don't, where they conflict, where they overlap. That would be my idea of where our discipline should go.
Beautiful.
Well, I think Fred's book tried to do that, right? That was the 5 ways. That was the attempt, sort of bring
Yeah, tried
everyone
to
in
do it,
dialogue.
and actually, my big takeaway message, my big takeaway on learning from that project and the message of the book is that, you know, the commonalities among those methods far outweighed their differences, and that the commonalities among those methods, I would think, form an awfully good starting point for methodological norms in our discipline. And then the special things that each of those methods could do that the other ones couldn't do would be appropriate for particular people with their sensibilities, particular problems and goals, and all that would be fine. So yeah, that book to me was moving toward what we're talking about. You know, I think Ruth Ellen Josleson's book on interviewing is absolutely fantastic. I mean, you know, that's good stuff. I'd like to hear somebody who says, no, that's not the way, you know, to do an interview. And I've got another way that I want to, you know, put up against that. And I think that would be healthy, but I also think she's gone a long way toward articulating a unified psychological theory of interviewing. And in terms of data collection, you know, it definitely answers Jean's need for, you know, collecting data and doing it in an amazing way. And also Neil's idea of depth, forming a data that's capable of yielding depth conclusions and analysis. The data goes deep and it's thick. And I think that should be an important norm for you know, for at least qualitative research.
We have 3 minutes left to go, and I see a gigantic question from Heidi. I don't just mean that it's a long question. I mean that the answer is gigantic. Does somebody want to tackle it in 3 sentences, or is it just Heidi? Would you like to speak to it a little bit?
I was just saying that, like, to me, like, this makes me think a lot about the SQIP task force putting forward the recommendation of methodological integrity. So I guess I'm trying to grapple with, like, is this what Fred is talking about? Because there we put forward like principles that were supposed to be for the whole field of qualitative psychology. And I think many of them would also work quite well for quantitative psychology too.
Yeah, I'd say in a word, yes. And actually your work on integrity, fidelity, and utility, I think you made the point, apply equally to quantitative as well as qualitative research. That's a great paper on methodological norms that are unifying and allow for diversity.
It is unifying, but it was framed. I mean, I think it's interesting to see how there's a kind of movement within quant research towards being more reflexive also that I see starting, which is—
Sure, reflexivity would be another principle that should apply to all psychological research.
Yes. So I feel like there may be even more bridges that we can make as, you know, movement occurs, but that's exciting.
And that will be a topic for next year's conference because our time is up. In person. Yeah. And nobody's going to click us off because our time is up. Thank you all. Thank you all for—
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for coming and being here.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you.